Okay, so next we're going to look at imperialism in Africa. And I want you to just look at this map and you can tell how much Africa is really kind of torn apart by the European nations during this time period. You can see influence from Belgium, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain. And then we also see some regions that stay independent. So I like talking about those. So we'll talk about that. Um, to start, I want to look at this poem that was written by an English journalist named The White Man's Burden. And this kind of fits in with the cultural reasons why imperialism happened. And this is what he said: Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught stolen peoples, half devil, half child. And we think the purpose of this was to promote the fact that Europeans felt cultural superiority to Africans, and like it was their responsibility to almost take care of that region of the world. What's really, really cool is there was a black author who responded called The Black Man's Burden, and it was all about the burden that they had to go through to please the Europeans and the white people that came in. Here's another image of a cultural reason why we see Europeans going into Africa and converting them to Christianity. And if we think about what was going on before imperialism in Africa, you're going to want to think about the major trade routes, and you're going to want to think about the use of Africans, especially in the West, for slavery in the Americas. Africa was mostly shaped by internal factors: the slave trade, the spread of Islam, and we see European influence starting to infiltrate the gold and salt trade and the slave trade. Slavery is going to be outlawed in the early 1800s, so we're not going to see that as a part of imperialism. That was something in time period 4. It's going to end in time period 5. Christian missionaries are going to go in, try to rebuild some areas where slavery had really taken hold. And in 1821, a lot of freed blacks are going to return from the Americas and build some settlements in Africa. And we see the East African and Indian Ocean trade becoming a new slave center that's going to continue on just for a bit. But in terms of imperialism, what we're going to see is we're going to see people looking towards Africa as a place for natural resources. Africans are going to continue to import guns and alcohol and factory goods that they're not making on their own. They're going to be exporting things like palm oil, gold, salt, ivory, and diamonds, especially from the south. So we see expanded presence in Africa, not with the slave trade, but just with trade in general. The French take Algeria in one of the first imperialistic movements in Africa in 1830. And the Dutch and the British are going to move into South Africa, and we're going to see them struggle over South Africa for a long time. And we see a bit more military built up. We see medicines sent to Africa to try to treat diseases like malaria. We're going to see the use of the steamship introduced in Africa to help trade. The biggest influence that we're going to see is something called the Scramble for Africa. So if you don't remember anything else, remember this one. And here's a political cartoon kind of portraying it. Once we see one group grab onto Africa and trying to take resources, one European group, you're going to see all the rest of the European nations wanting to grab a piece of it, and they start to scramble for it. So European nations wanted to colonize or wanted to imperialize Africa for its natural resources, and each nation is going to race to grab whatever sections that they can of Africa. This is called the Great Scramble. And they actually have a conference where they decide that they can do this. It's called the Berlin Conference. It was held in Germany, and it had representatives from all major European powers coming together to decide when they can go take parts of Africa. What can they take? But if you think about it, who was not invited? anybody from Africa. So this was called by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, and it was held from 1884 to 1885. European powers are going to agree that effective occupation would replace the former trading relations in Africa. Not just trading posts in Africa, but actual occupations of territories within Africa. Governments must present control of the regions that they took, not just trade interests and merchants, and every country would send troops in to participate in the partition of Africa and to keep as much peace as possible. In the next 20 years, Europeans partition almost the entire continent. They redraw the map of Africa with no regard or little regard of traditional ethnic boundaries that existed. They create these nations for themselves, but they're really sometimes blending groups ethnically that don't get along. Britain controlled a lot of East and South Africa. France obtained most of Western Africa. And King Leopold in Belgium are going to contain the Congo. So this is a famous political cartoon showing the depletion of resources in Africa, all going to Europe and to the United States. So we see all of these natural resources, and we tie it back to one of the causes of imperialism, which was the Industrial Revolution and the economic causes. With more and more industry in these nations, they need more raw materials, and they're going to look to Africa for that. This cartoon is another famous political cartoon. You see, this is representing the Berlin Conference. And here we have European officials with a cake named Africa, and they're just splitting up and cutting up the pieces of it and handing them out to each other. So this is what results from the Berlin Conference and from the Great Scramble of Africa. You can see the British ruling over the South and actually a lot of territory in the East. You can see the French gain a lot of territory in the West. Belgium gains territory in the middle in the Congo. Then you can even see groups like the Portuguese. Portuguese have a territory here and here. Russians tried to take some territory. Italians tried to take some territory. So we really see almost every European nation trying to get a piece of Africa. One of the biggest sparks of this is going to be where we see the part in Africa by the equator being divided between the French and Portuguese. And we're going to see some explorers going through. Europeans are going to farm out huge pieces of land to private companies to make money, offering them monopolies over natural resources. And we see very, very brutal abuses of indigenous people. We're going to see Belgium really spark the taking of land in Africa. He's going to oversee the invasion of the colony of Congo. He's going to send troops to imperialize. He's going to harvest ivory and rubber from Congo. The people who work doing that are going to get almost no payment at all. And we almost see a reign of terror where laborers who didn't meet quotas for getting those resources are going to be killed. We think about 3 to 8 million people in the Congo were killed when Belgium went in and took over. So this was not a peaceful colonizing of Africa. This was a very harsh, violent colonizing of Africa. Another significant group we're going to see are the British in South Africa. It's a little different from the rest of the continent at this time because of the number of European settlers who actually came and settled in South Africa, rather than just using it as an economic stronghold. The British are going to replace the Dutch after the Dutch had been settled in South Africa for quite some time. We see a city named Cape Town. It's a really strategic location at the bottom of Africa. And the rest of South Africa, we're going to see fertile land, deposits of gold, diamonds especially, copper, coal, and iron ore. So we see some tensions between two groups of people. Afrikaneers, which are South Africans who descended from the Dutch and French settlers. They had lived there for a while. And the British who were now coming in. Europeans are going to start pouring into South Africa after the discovery of diamonds and gold. And there was a famous British entrepreneur named Cecil Rhodes. He was a politician involved in the expansion of the British Empire from Central to South Africa. You can see here, this is an image of him basically saying that the British can have control of the entire continent and that the continent would almost become a puppet to the British. He became the Prime Minister of Cape Colony, Cape Town, from 1890 to 1896. He made his fortune in diamonds, mining diamonds and selling those diamonds. He worked with the British South Africa Company, a joint stock company, to push as far north into Central Africa as he could. And he founded 2 colonies that he named after himself, Zimbabwe and Zambia in Africa. So you can see here when looking more at Cecil Rhodes, British entrepreneur, politician in the expansion of British power into Africa. And here's what he says: I contend that we are the first race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. If there be a God, I think that what he would like me to do is paint as much of the map of Africa British red as possible. Now, when we look at this, like in this day and age, we're like, wow, this guy, very cocky, very one-sided, very ignorant to what Africa was like. But what I want you to do is I want you to imagine writing a DBQ and thinking of his point of view, thinking back to Charles Darwin and those cultural causes for imperialism. And I want you to almost put yourself in his shoes, not saying that what he is saying is right, but I just want you to imagine the purpose and the point of view of what he is saying and where he's coming from. In terms of resistance, we actually see some good resistance from African nations, especially because colonial rule is going to disrupt a lot of African customs. Farmers and herders are pushed off their land or forced to work. Africans worked for very little money, if none at all. High taxes that Africans had to pay, regardless of their low income, were becoming frustrated to them. Families were broken up. Men were constantly working. And then missionaries came in and helped Africans by opening schools. And a lot of these schools taught them Western academics that's going to help them fight against Europeans that are coming in. So here's the comparison that you would see to the British Raj in India. You see this European settler being treated prince-like by Africans. And so you're going to see the frustration that's building up in Africa. One of the first resistance movements that we see is not really a war between traditional African inhabitants, but it's a war between the Dutch and the English in South Africa over diamonds. We call it the Boer War. It's a war between those Dutch who were already there and the British who come in to control the land. It's eventually won by the British, and when the British took control of South Africa, they're going to establish these concentration-style camps where they segregate South Africa by race. We see Africans and some Boers, the Dutch, who are going to be put in these camps with really harsh conditions, working camps. And it's going to lead to a lot of division and segregation in Africa for a while. We see this lasting all the way until Nelson Mandela in time period 6 is going to be fighting to try to fix the segregation in South Africa. In 1913, the South African Parliament is going to pass a law to try to forbid Africans from owning land elsewhere. So we're going to look more at this in time period 6. We also see another resistance movement led by the Zulu Kingdom located on the East African coast. They're going to fight the British, and they are going to unfortunately lose and become part of a British colony. Europeans are going to meet a lot of resistance across Africa. Algerians are going to battle the French. The British are going to battle groups in South and West Africa. Germans are going to fight for lands in East Africa. And they're actually going to lose. They're going to try to get regions that they're not going to be able to get control of. Specifically, Ethiopia. Ethiopia is famous for resisting European colonization and maintaining its independence in this time period. They were a Christian kingdom. Italians attempted to invade it, but the Ethiopians were prepared and actually defeated them in battle. And this is one of the most famous stories of African resistance against European imperialism. This is actually going to be used by Italy leading into World War II. They're going to feel frustrated that they didn't get that territory in Africa, and they're going to go back and try to imperialize. One of the last things for imperialism, it's less going into deep Africa and taking resources, and more seeing that British style of control for trade networks that we saw in India. And that's going to do with the Suez Canal, which is a canal that leads from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, vice versa. So leaders in Egypt began reforms on their own to modernize and industrialize. They started to construct the Suez Canal. And they couldn't fund it on their own, so they worked with the French to help build it around the year 1869. And the Egyptian government, unfortunately, had to sell its shares to Great Britain because all of the work that went into it was too expensive for them. Great Britain was really the only nation that could buy out the Suez Canal. With that, it gave Great Britain control of that canal. And they sent an army into Egypt in 1882 to protect it, almost like a protectorate. We see that this builds even more and more British supremacy. And they almost indirectly rule over Egypt for 70 years by having control of that Suez Canal. But the canal was great in opening up trade in all the regions. So one of the things you might be picking out at this point is that England is really going to be in control of a lot of what's going on in imperialism. So this is a famous political cartoon showing England having their hand almost in every area controlling it.